Nation, Shawn Coleman here with a special edition of the Grizzly Bear Blues Live podcast. And usually when we have these special editions of Grizzly Bear Blues Live, it's because we've gotten some breaking news when it comes to the Memphis Grizzlies. And this Saturday certainly was full of it, and there's plenty to dive into. Of course, my name's Shawn Coleman. You can find me at StatsSAC on Twitter. Make sure you follow all the great podcast content from both Bluff City Media and Grizzly Bear Blues at bluffcitymedia.co, as well as many great social media sites across all forms of social media, including at BCM Grizzlies. But of course, let's dive into it. The first and most impactful news of the day was a confirmation of the news that many of us had really hoped would not come, to fruition, but certainly did, unfortunately. It was announced that Steven Adams, who is absolutely critical to this Grizzlies roster, performing to the best of its ability on a consistent basis, it was announced that the PCL sprain that has kept him out of action since late January, it will more than likely keep him out for the rest of the playoffs. Not much more news beyond that. We know that there has been some, intensified treatment options that the Grizzlies have looked at to really try to get Steven Adams back to, playing shape, getting back to 100%. It just seems like that the different avenues the Grizzlies have taken with Adams has not yet let him get back to the form that they need him to be. And of course, and rightfully so, the Grizzlies are not going to push him, to go back on the court unless he's at 100%. So definitely a less than ideal announcement, but as we'll get into a little bit later on in the podcast, I do think that it's been a blessing in disguise that this news has been more of a gradual development than it is something that's come out of the blue or that's developed immediately. We'll get into that a little bit later on in the show. But of course, the other news, and a lot of this had to do with with Steven Adams being unavailable, as well as the recent injury scare that happened with Santi Aldama. It was announced that Kenneth Lofton, on a two-way contract for much of this year, the 2022-2023 G League Rookie of the Year, Kenneth Lofton has signed a new 4-year, $7 million deal with the Grizzlies and will become a part of the active roster so that he can be available as a front court depth option for the Grizzlies in the playoffs. To make that move happen, the Grizzlies made another, perhaps what was the most surprising move of the day, in that they waived guard Kennedy Chandler. The Grizzlies drafted Chandler, 38th overall in the 2022 NBA draft. They're now waiving him, even though they signed him to a 4-year contract when they selected him. They are waiving him to make a roster spot on the active roster. And so that may come as a bit of a surprise. We'll again discuss that in just a moment. The other move, though, to fill the two-way spot that Kenneth Lofton was filling for the Grizzlies is that the Grizzlies did sign Jacob Gilyard from the hustle to that two-way spot. Now, for Gilyard, we'll start there in terms of the short and long-term significance. So again, just for those keeping tallies at home, it was announced that Steven Adams is likely not going to be available for the playoffs. In other words, it's more than likely, it seems very certain that his year is done. Kenneth Lofton has signed an actual NBA contract to be with the roster. He's signed this year, but also has signed basically a 4-year, $7 million contract to be with the Grizzlies long-term, but to also be a part of their roster and be a front court depth option for the playoffs. To make room for him on the roster, the Grizzlies waived Kennedy Chandler, and they now have signed from the hustle Jacob Gilyard to be a two-way player for the rest of the regular season. We'll start with Gilyard, and when it comes to him being a two-way player, we're looking at that basically being relevant this season for one more day. That's the thing. Well, not necessarily one more day, but, for the rest of, the time until the playoffs actually start. Gilyard being signed to this two-way position, number one, will allow for him to be available tomorrow against the Thunder when much of the Grizzlies' depth will be playing, while many of their main rotation players will sit out, since the Grizzlies already have the number 2 spot wrapped up for the playoffs. But for Gilyard, it's an opportunity to potentially get NBA minutes. It's an opportunity to work with the team and practice with them over the next week. What happens beyond this year remains to be seen. But for Gilyard, it's an opportunity for him to be able to be at the NBA level, experience life with an NBA team, and perhaps the impact can be there to where he may be able to parlay this into another two-way opportunity next year. or potentially be, another option for the hustle once again. So not much relevance in terms of Gilliard being signed to the two-way contract, but it is an opportunity for him tomorrow against the Thunder and for the next several days as the Grizzlies practice and ramp up for the playoffs. He'll be able to be with the organization at the NBA level to make an impression. But of course, when we start getting into the relevant and significant news in the short term and the long term, the Grizzlies basically made a decision out of a short-term need. But I also think in terms of a long-term preference. And that's basically that they replaced Kennedy Chandler's roster spot and his contract over the next 4 years with Kenneth Lofton. Now, to whatever opinion you may have of who the better prospect is, I definitely think that between Kenneth Lofton and Kennedy Chandler, you likely had similar overall projections when it comes to what type of NBA players they'll be. Obviously, two different types of profiles. Kenneth Lofton in the front court, Kennedy Chandler in the back court. But Kennedy Chandler's long-term projection as an NBA player likely was as a backup point guard whose strengths were as a defensive impact player when bench units were on the court, but also as a pretty decent playmaker and one that could, eventually get, to scoring as time went on. But make no mistake about it. And unfortunately, I keep Kennedy Chandler close to my heart, being a former Vol. When it comes to Kennedy Chandler, the physical limitations that he had was going to make things hard to begin with a league that continues to grow. But also there was the concern about his overall shot from distance long term. That matters, especially for a coaching staff and an organization that has spoke to the importance of shot quality and shot value as time goes on. I definitely think that for another team that's on a rebuilding timeline, Kennedy Chandler is a talent to bring in to see if there could be a long-term rotation piece there for him as a point guard off the bench. And perhaps in time, his shot may develop. But it makes sense, both from a roster standpoint, a business standpoint, and just in general in terms of what the Grizzlies are valuing right now when it comes to their depth and development. It made sense that Kennedy Chandler was the most sensible roster option to remove in order to make a place long-term for Kenneth Lofton. Because to be honest with you, the need for Kenneth Lofton, I don't think there's any mistake to be made. The overall goal, the overall long-term goal with Kenneth Lofton was to make him a part of this roster. But that was likely going to be a decision the Grizzlies were wanting to make once the summer arrived. Now, because of the need, with Brandon Clark already out for the season and a good portion of next season, they're now being, more of a, into the summer concern with Steven Adams. There's not enough out there to know about next year, but at the very least, it's a bigger concern with Steven Adams' injury now than it was, even a few weeks ago. And obviously, the recent injury to Santi Aldama, the Grizzlies need to go with some type of familiar option in the front court to support Jaren, to support X, and hopefully Aldama in the playoffs. And Kenneth Lofton just made the most sense. Now, what does it mean for him long term? Well, long term, with his new contract in place, I think that it definitely was the right move now to get guaranteed front court depth in the playoffs. It also is a good move for the Grizzlies to get him signed so that they know that they have him next year when they're going to need front court depth again, with Brandon Clark likely being out for a significant portion of next season. But beyond that, beyond next year, you're going to see Xavier Tillman's current contract expire. I do think the Grizzlies will pick up the last year of his option since they'll need front court depth next year. But if Xavier Tillman's current contract is expiring next year, then next year and beyond, Kenneth Lofton becomes that fourth or fifth big off the bench who can fill in the rotation when he's needed. He may not necessarily be in the rotation all the time, but I do feel like he is someone that is more than capable of making an impact 10 to 15 minutes a night when his number is called. And for a league that, again, we know is getting bigger, for a league that we know is getting more offensive-oriented, and for a league that when the reserve units and the bench units come on during the game, having good offensive skills probably matters a bit more than defensive skills. Kenneth Lofton was a sensible long-term choice in terms of the circumstances the Grizzlies currently are facing than Kennedy Chandler. So it was a sensible move. Obviously a move the Grizzlies likely did not anticipate having to make, probably one they didn't want to make in general, but it was a move that needed to be made. So the move to go with Kenneth Lofton for the short-term depth, short-term support now, but also having him in place now long-term. and seeing how he'll continue to develop and where he could develop into a valuable front court depth rotation piece in time, the Grizzlies went ahead, made that move. You have to applaud them for that, even if it came to the expense of Kennedy Chandler, but certainly wish Kennedy Chandler nothing but the best. Again, I think there definitely is enough talent when it comes to Kennedy Chandler for him to be a worthwhile investment for a rebuilding team to hopefully see if he can become an eventual rotation player in the NBA. But we've talked about the moves that happened because of the biggest news of all. We talked about what the short and long-term ramifications are for signing Kenneth Lofton Jr. to a long-term deal and obviously waiving Kennedy Chandler. But what does it mean when it comes to Steven Adams now being out for the season? Well, for one, it really shines a light on what's going on with Steven Adams. It definitely seems as if the injury that was labeled as a PCL sprain back in late January, it certainly seems to be as if that injury is more serious than had initially been anticipated. What that means for the short and long term, it's unknown. The Grizzlies themselves may not necessarily know at this point in time. I do think that it's fair to infer from the news that we have received that it does seem as if whatever options the Grizzlies have tried to do to get Steven Adams back to as close to 100% or at 100% as soon as possible, those options, for whatever reason, are not seeming to work. Again, don't want to speculate on what this means for Steven Adams in the near future, what it may mean for him into the summer or beyond this summer. We'll know more in time. But for right now, it definitely is the fact that this injury does seem to be, more serious, for the lack of a better way of putting it, than it was even, a few weeks ago, and that the Grizzlies are just simply, and again, rightfully so, they are simply keeping Steven Adams, for the long term. They're keeping that as the main preference. They're keeping that as the utmost priority, and they're doing right by him to make sure when he's ready to return to action, which certainly hope that sooner rather than later, he's able to return to action at 100% without any concerns moving forward. But without Steven Adams, there is a bit of concern in overall when it comes to the Grizzlies' overall chances of really making a deep postseason run. Make no mistake about it. Steven Adams, even if he doesn't make a big impact, or even if he doesn't appear, anywhere near as much as other Grizzlies do in the counting statistics and the box scores, there's plenty out there, and we've seen many people who have discussed this. There's plenty out there to show just how impactful Steven Adams is when he is on the court. His support of elevating the games of Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr., among others, it's undeniable, especially on the offensive end. The support that he's shown with Jaren Jackson Jr. on the defensive end, really being a key cog to being able to defend the rim, defend the paint for the Grizzlies, where Jaren Jackson Jr. can have more freedom to roam around and impact other activity that's going on when opponents have the ball. That now is not going to be as much of a advantage for the Grizzlies as it was when both players are on the court. And of course, his offensive rebounding. The biggest concern for the Grizzlies now going into the playoffs is, will they be able to rebound enough to limit the second chance opportunities for teams that they'll play in the playoffs? That's going to be a hard thing to overcome. It's been a hard thing for this Grizzlies team to overcome without Steven Adams. That is going to be a very hard weakness to hide at times in the playoffs. And of course, the need for Steven Adams with his offensive rebounding, creating second chance points, that is what made him such a huge piece to the Grizzlies' success since the start of last year. So without a doubt, it needs to be said because it's the absolute truth. This Grizzlies roster is at their best when they can feature Steven Adams in a prominent role. And unfortunately, they're not going to be able to do that, more than likely, for the rest of this season. And coupled with the previous injury to Brandon Clark, the Grizzlies' front court depth has taken a huge hit. And we saw last year just how important that front court depth was in the series against Minnesota, and also how the lack of front court depth was exposed by the Warriors and Kevon Looney's rebounding in the second round of last year. The hope is that you don't run the hope is you don't run into that again this year, but it's going to be a hard thing to prevent without both Steven Adams and Brandon Clark. So where does the difference come from? How do the Grizzlies overcome not having Steven Adams. Well, this gets back to the point that I made a bit earlier in the show, and that it's been a blessing in disguise. It has been a good thing. Obviously, it's less than ideal that we lost Steven Adams, but it's been a good thing that the Grizzlies have now had over 2 months to adapt to life with Steven Adams. And here's the key thing. They've adapted without him. They have been able to figure out the trade for Luke Kennard, featuring their shooters more, passing the basketball more, gaining more benefit from moving the basketball. All those things have allowed for the Grizzlies to be able to get more consistent on offense, and that's how they've been able to find ways to win and adapt to life without Steven Adams to play winning basketball. Now, a few factors come into that. Number one, the Grizzlies' schedule has certainly helped them out. They played one of the easier schedules over the past 25 games of any team in the NBA. So that definitely has helped them out. It's going to be harder for the Grizzlies to replicate consistently above average to elite offense in the playoffs than it was during post-All-Star break this season, because the Grizzlies are just simply going to be facing better competition. But make no mistake about it, the Grizzlies are better equipped to find that consistent offense, especially in the half court now, than they were even a month ago. And it simply comes down to the fact that the Grizzlies have been able to capitalize on shooting the three better to complement what they can do in the paint. Now, individually, we've seen a big reason for this being Desmond Bane becoming a more consistent scorer, Luke Kennard arguably being the best three-point shooter in the league since he was traded to the Grizzlies, and obviously Jaren Jackson Jr. turning a corner to where he is an absolutely elite difference maker both on the offensive and defensive end. Now, those three things are going to have to remain consistent. Without a shadow of a doubt, the Grizzlies are going to have to see Desmond Bane and Ja Morant be either on the level or clearly the best offensive duo in any series that they play from this point on. That is going to have to be an absolute truth. Desmond Bane and Ja Morant are going to have to be one of, if not the best offensive duos in the playoffs this year for the Grizzlies to now make a deep playoff run. But it also comes down to the Grizzlies' ability to shoot the three and defend the three on a consistent basis for them to be able to get the job done. Because if they can do that, that helps to negate the overall impact of the Grizzlies losing the rebound battle, because at that point, and here's the big key of them all, at that point, with Steven Adams, the reason why he was so important is because per possession, the Grizzlies struggled in terms of their production, but they were able to still win because of the extra possessions that Steven Adams was able to gain them. Now, since they have adapted to life without Steven Adams, the Grizzlies have done a great job of improving their production per possession. That's really what has stood out about the Grizzlies without Steven Adams. So in the playoffs, when possessions are going to become even more important, when your production per possession, finding the best shot as effectively and consistently as possible becomes more important now than ever, the Grizzlies are in a much better position to do that now without Steven Adams than they were even a month ago. So the Grizzlies' ability to consistently generate offense, the Grizzlies' ability to be able to both shoot and defend a three, those are two very important factors for them to find success moving forward without Steven Adams and Brandon Clarke in the playoff. The two players now, the two biggest X factors for the Grizzlies now are without a doubt going to be Jaren Jackson Jr. and Dillon Brooks. And the reason, obviously, for Jaren Jackson Jr. is the Grizzlies simply need this. Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to need to continue to play at a clearly all-NBA level for the Grizzlies to be able to win playoff series. And that starts with, number one, with him staying on the court. It's going to be a tough task for him to be able to do that because teams are certainly going to target trying to get him in foul trouble early in playoff games. But if Jaren can stay on the court, he's now built up a consistent enough level of play where he clearly can be elite on the offensive and defensive end, and he could be the difference maker. Jaren Jackson Jr.'s play itself can win us playoff series. We saw flashes of it last year. We saw it more consistent this year. I think there's a very good chance his play can win us a playoff series this season. So Jaren Jackson Jr. staying on the court and his overall play is the biggest X factor moving forward. But the reason why Dillon Brooks now becomes even more important is because of multiple ways that he can impact the game. Number one, he himself needs to stay on the court. We know that he can be prone to fouling a lot as well. But the Grizzlies are going to ask him to be a bit more complex. They're going to make his defensive utilization a bit more complex, just like we saw last year in the playoffs, where at times the Grizzlies had very successful lineups with Dillon playing the 4. We saw in Friday night's game the Grizzlies feature a starting lineup of John Morant, Desmond Bane, Luke Kennard, Dillon at the 4, Jaren at the 5. There's a very good chance that is our best lineup in playoff series moving forward. And if Dillon can play at the 4, or at the very least can be on the floor consistently, guarding the opposing team's best scorer, we know he can produce in that capacity. But even more importantly is Dillon continuing to settle into a role in which he is the 4th option on offense, but he's effective in that role, facilitating for others, making good shots, being able to hit threes consistently. If we could see Dillon shoot, over 40% from 3, or at the very least, if we could see him shoot in the high 30s and take 3 to 5 threes per game, and he himself not take a lot of bad shots, that will be a huge boost to the Grizzlies, to where he's providing most of his value on defense, and when he is needed, he can be able to come through offensively. Over the past month, the past 2 to 4 weeks, Dillon has done a great job in that role. If he can continue to do that into the playoffs, that'll be a huge boost to Memphis. So Dillon and Jaren staying on the court, them being able to continue to make the defense for the Grizzlies one of the best of any teams in the playoffs, and Jaren overall being a primary option on offense, with Dillon being an effective contributor on offense when his number is called. Those are what make Dillon Brooks and Jaren Jackson Jr. the 2 biggest X factors moving forward for the Grizzlies without Steven Adams. But at the end of the day, again, and we'll break down more statistics, we'll break down more film, we'll give you more of an in-depth analysis of how the Grizzlies can get the job done against certain opponents once those opponents are known. But again, for me, it comes down to shooting and defending the 3. And I understand that's always been the case. Myself and others have mentioned before that as this core matured, as the Grizzlies added more to this core, for this team to truly be a championship contender in today's game, one of the biggest areas where they were going to have to start consistently finding advantages is shooting the 3 and defending the 3. That hasn't changed, but the Grizzlies' ability to consistently create that advantage in those areas, they have become more consistent in that area. Take this, for instance. In life without Steven Adams, but with Luke Kennard since he was traded for, basically our sample size of that is after the All-Star game this year. Over that time, the Grizzlies are 6th in three-pointers per game, and they're 14th in three-point field goal percentage. In terms of defense, the Grizzlies are 27th in three-pointers allowed per game, and a lot of that has to do with the simple fact that the Grizzlies have given up 21 threes in 3 of the past 6 games. But overall, despite that recent surge, the Grizzlies since the All-Star break remain 7th in opponents' field goal percentage. So if the Grizzlies, who are averaging, who are shooting 37% from 3 since the All-Star break, if the Grizzlies can shoot 37% from 3 or better, and they can keep their opponents lower than that, that's going to be a big, big boost to the Grizzlies not only winning games, but also winning playoff series. Because since the start of last year, in the 47 games where the Grizzlies have shot 37% or better, but they've limited their opponents to shooting 37% or worse, the Grizzlies are 44-3. They have the 2nd highest winning percentage in such games of all teams in the NBA. And though that winning percentage continues to go up, the more threes the Grizzlies make. They make in the teens, or they make above 15 threes, and they make 37 or more percent of them while keeping their opponents below 37%, the Grizzlies can get the job done. That's exactly what they have done since the All-Star break this year, and they've become one of the better teams in the NBA without Steven Adams. Yes, it's going to be harder to do that on a consistent basis against the quality of opponents that the Grizzlies will be playing in the playoffs, but the Grizzlies are more equipped now than ever to do exactly that. So for the Grizzlies to make the deep postseason run many of us have hoped they would make this season, it's going to be now more than ever reliant on them playing good defense, their best players staying on the court, and more importantly than anything else, in my opinion, how well they can shoot and defend the three. So definitely not the best of days when it comes to the Grizzlies. Saturdays have not been fun to cover when it comes to being a Grizzlies fan and in covering the Grizzlies, over the past 2 or so months. But the good thing is that this is not anything that comes as a surprise. This was always a potential development that the Grizzlies were going to have to deal with. Thankfully, the coaching staff and the roster have successfully shown that they can find ways to win. They can find ways to win and adapt without Steven Adams. It's just going to become more critical than ever, the improvements that the Grizzlies have made in those key areas: shooting the three, defending the three, good half-court offense, moving the basketball, finding the best shot possible on a consistent basis, featuring Jaren, featuring Desmond as a counter to when teams load up to stop Ja. That's what matters. But we can break down all the different statistics. We can break down all the different perspectives that they want. At the end of the day, what the Grizzlies need more than ever is just for their 3 best players to play at the level that we all know that they're capable of. And if they could do that, because remember, one big key to remember is this. Last year, the Grizzlies won a playoff series with Steven Adams not being a factor at all after the struggles that he had in Game 1. In the second round, the Grizzlies were competitive with the Golden State Warriors with Steven Adams not available or limited. Now, to be fair, the rebounding of Kevon Looney and the overall ability that Steven Adams could have provided to give the Grizzlies second chances, that would have been absolutely huge as Golden State and Memphis figured each other out in the second round of the playoffs. But the other key thing is not only have the Grizzlies figured out how to win without Steven Adams this year, they also know how to do it because they were able to do it last year in the playoffs. Again, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of Steven Adams. I'm just trying to prove that the Grizzlies have plenty of proof that they can find ways to win and they can consistently do what they need to do to win games against quality competition even without one of their better players available. So hopefully we'll continue. There won't be any more negative news as the regular season ends tomorrow. Hoping that Santi Aldama's injury definitely, heals as time goes on and he'll be close to 100% once the playoffs start next weekend. Thanks so much for joining us here on this special edition of Grizzly Bear Blues Live. My name is Shawn Coleman. You can find me at StatsSAC on Twitter. Make sure you follow all the great coverage of all Memphis sports when it comes to BluffCityMedia.co, and also follow Bluff City on all forms of social media, as well as at BCM Grizzlies on Twitter and all forms of social media as well. Stick with our great podcast content as well as the written content at BluffCityMedia.co for the latest on the Memphis Grizzlies. Plenty to come when it comes to who we're going to play in the first round and how this roster will continue to be able to adapt based off who's available. My name's Shawn Coleman. It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a great Saturday. We'll talk to you again soon here on Grizzly Bear Blues Live.